Hi, welcome to yet another Wednesday Seeker Study. Thank you for coming. Today we're actually going to be looking at Acts 20. The title of this topic is, we're again looking at Paul's The Curious Tales from the New Testament, and today's teaching is The Dangers of Not Paying Attention in Church. Now in Acts 20, before I read the verses, we do encounter kind of a fascinating story. By this point in the book of Acts, Paul has already concluded his final work in Greece, and he's in the midst of saying farewell to the Christians in Asia Minor. He's already spent 6.5 days in Troas, and is down to his final night there. So as a result, of course, he's going to spend his final hours teaching, preaching, worshiping God, and breaking bread in the upper room, amidst what we would call a house church gathering. During this event, a young man named Eutychus decided it would be a great idea to sit on the sill of an open window, third-story window no less. The sermon ran rather long. The verse tells us that Paul went on and on. Eutychus fell asleep. He falls out of the window, and before his family could even start planning the funeral, because consequently he died, God used Paul to raise him to life again. So, is this a warning about staying awake in church? You decide. I think there might be more reasons to putting this in the Bible, because Luke didn't just put things in for the sake of writing and filling up space. It does make one wonder, though, why, if this is why church sanctuaries are often on the first floor, on the ground floor. Kind of makes me go, So, Acts 20, verses 7 through 12. Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together, and in a windowsill sat a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third-floor window and was taken up dead. But Paul went down, fell on him, embracing him, and said, "Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him." Now when he had come up, he had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even until daybreak, and he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted. Verse 7 talks about it being on the first day of the week when they came together to break bread. This is one of, if not the first certain example of Christians making a practice of gathering together on the first day of the week, we would understand it as Sunday, for fellowship and the word. Now there is some debate here, but for Jewish believers, they would have gathered Saturday evening because Sunday was a normal working day for them. But this was in Greece, where there probably had been a mainly Gentile congregation. So, of course, I looked up the words used here, and the word Sabbaton, which is used for Sabbath, would have been on Saturday. But it adds another word, heis, H-E-I-S, indicating the first or one, which is where we get the translation, the first day of the week, or Sunday. Gentile believers, any believers actually, were no longer required to keep the Saturday Sabbath. Some commentators say this began at sunset on Saturday, the ending of Sabbath, and going through the night into Sunday, the first day of the week. But it's curious in all this talk about Sabbaths and the first days of the week. In Acts 18, 5 through 6, it reads, "When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit, and he testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, 'Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles.'" And if you're wondering why I put that verse in, because it has nothing to do with the Sabbath, there's always a reason. After this is written, after this happened with Paul, the Sabbath isn't mentioned as a Sabbath any longer. Now, when you go on in there, they were gathering together, they were breaking bread. Now, the breaking of bread refers to the sharing of a common meal. We would call them fellowship dinners when I was in another church. I think we still call them fellowship dinners. You get together, talk about the Lord, have a meal together, and it would be accompanied with a communion service. But he spoke to them and he continued his message until midnight. because Paul, if you remember, was getting ready to depart the next day. He didn't really know if or when he would see these believers again. So he preached for some 6 hours. The time he began to preach, we don't really know for sure, but we're told he concluded at the break of the next day, excluding the little minor interruption around midnight when he was interrupted by the fall and death of Eutychus. This was around the time of Pentecost, so perhaps this was around the beginning of May. The sun would set there around 7 p.m. and rose at about 5, so the night was about 8 to 10 hours long. Paul must have preached a sermon not less than 6 hours long. But it's likely also that this wasn't all a straight sermon. A good part of the time was probably employed in hearing and answering questions. The word here used is dialegomai, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I failed miserably during the actual study. And it means to converse, to have discourse, to argue or discuss. So they had some back and forth in discussing some of these things during this time. So verse 9 tells us a certain young man named Eutychus fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. I personally find it hard to believe someone could fall asleep when Paul was preaching, but Paul did teach for many hours. On and on he went. And there's also some evidence that Eutychus fought the sleep as best he could. The tenses they use in the Greek verbs portray poor Eutychus as being gradually overcome, despite perhaps a struggle to remain awake. However it happened, the combination of the late hour, the heat, perhaps the fumes from the oil lamps, made the young man Eutychus fall asleep. The word translated sleep here is the word from which we get the word hypnosis. Oddly enough, Eutychus's name means lucky or fortunate one. If you look at him at this point, that doesn't seem to fit very well. He's described as a young man. The Greek word is Neanias, and the word also pais, P-A-I-S, is used where it's translated boy. The first term for young man would be applied to a young man between the ages of 24 to 40. That's used in verse 9. It was common to use the second term, pais, this was in verse 12, to describe a boy between the ages of 10 to 14, although there's some variation in that. It can be used in other ways. Not sure of his age. I think it's generally held that he was probably a teenager, but I had to look up the words, and it doesn't make it very clear to me one way or the other. But it says in verse 10, "Do not trouble yourself, for his life is in him." When Paul goes downstairs, he finds Eutychus dead. He stretches himself out on the dead boy and embraces him. That's from Acts 20:10. Fell on him is the word epipipto, which means to lie upon. Embraces is another very large word, which I'm not going to try to say, and it means to embrace completely. It gives you a pretty clear picture of what Paul did. Now, those terms and this lying on and embracing him should sound familiar. We're going to look at Elijah and Elisha in the Old Testament. First one is 1 Kings 17 through 21, and it reads, "Now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was so serious that there was no breath left in him. So she said to Elijah, 'What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?' And he said to her, 'Give me your son.' So he took her out of his arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying and laid him on his own bed. Then he cried out to the Lord and said, 'O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge by killing her son?' And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord and said, 'O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him.' Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived." Stretched himself out is the word madad, which pretty much means what it says, stretched himself out. 2 Kings 4:32 to 37 is regarding an incident with Elisha. "When Elisha came into the house, there was the child lying dead on his bed. He went in therefore and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay on the child and put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. He returned and walked back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on him. And then the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. And he called Gehazi and said to him, "Call the Shunammite woman." So he called her, and when she came into him, he said, "Pick up your son." So she went in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. Stretching himself out here is a different word. It's gahar, and it is, easy translation again this time, to prostrate yourself or stretch yourself out. So different words are used in these accounts, but essentially it's the exact same meaning. In both cases, Elijah and Elisha may have felt personally responsible, albeit unintentionally, for the death of the boy. In both cases, they stretched themselves out on the dead boy, embraced him, and asked God to raise him. In the middle of Paul's distress over the death of Eutychus, he took a step of faith, and he acted like Elijah and Elisha. In my mind, that took a great deal of boldness, since Elijah and Elisha were not ordinary men that just anyone can imitate. There are other resurrections recorded in the Bible, including miracles performed by Peter, which would be Tabitha in Acts 9:36 through 42. Of course, Jesus himself, Jairus' daughter in Luke 8, and Lazarus in John 11. Back to Paul and Eutychus, he said his life is in him. The word for life is suke, which means the breath of life, the life force or the soul, indicating to us that Eutychus did indeed die. And here, Paul is telling them that his life has been restored. Marshall notes that Paul's comment that the boy's life was in him refers to his condition after he ministered to him. This would be allaying any questions as to the fact that he wasn't dead, that he was maybe mostly dead, as Miracle Max observed in The Princess Bride. He says Luke would not have devoted space to the raising up of somebody who was merely or apparently dead. Besides, if Luke was an eyewitness to the event, he would know, because, he was a doctor. Just saying. Even Bones would concur. Verse 11 says they talked for a long while. Paul talked for a long while, even till daybreak. Paul, obviously by now getting their attention back, and everyone probably being wide awake after this experience, continued preaching until daybreak. Logos indicates continuous speaking, what we would call a discourse. Now I have a little aside here, which is kind of curious, and that there may be a connection between this account of Paul and Eutychus and between the father and the prodigal son. It starts with the word Epipesen, which is found in Luke 15 and in Acts 20, here where we're studying today. This word in its exact grammatical form and meaning is in the parable of the prodigal son, at the moment of their reunion after the son returns home, in Luke 15:20 to 21, and it reads, "And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son.'" And we know then that the son begins to apologize, but his father interrupts him. Verses 22 to 24 read, "But the father said to his servants, 'Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to be merry." Luke's choice of words in Acts 20 brings to mind this story in Luke 15. Paul throws himself on Eutychus, just as the father throws himself on the prodigal son. There are no questions of fault. Luke gives us the details, and we know why things fall apart as they do with the father and the son. The father gave and the son squandered. Paul preached past midnight, Eutychus fell asleep on a third-floor windowsill. Some would say Paul was to blame. Some would say Eutychus was to blame. We could parcel out blame to all the parties. Indulgent fathers and wayward sons, windy preachers or bored teenagers, making sure each one got their share of the blame. But blame isn't the point here. Being found is the point. After being dead, after being lost, each are alive and found, and the grace is shared by all. When the prodigal son came home, it says, and they began to be merry. Monty Python would say, and there was much rejoicing. And even here, after Paul raises this young man from the dead, Eutychus, they all have a celebration too, in honor of what God had done. Now, this does present us with a variety of questions, not the least of which is what was his purpose in including this account? What lessons did Luke hope that his readers would gain from this? What can we draw from this? Is it something as simple as warning against the dangers of falling asleep in church? Or of, long-winded preaching, perhaps? Some suggest the point may simply be about the power of God to heal, to show that he can, to show that his life-giving power, and to further authenticate Paul as a true apostle, and to therefore authenticate his message. By including the miraculous resuscitations performed by Peter and Paul in Acts, Luke appears to be showing that they are both carrying on the work of Jesus Christ after his death, and Jesus' Spirit is at work in them. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, 11 through 12, I have become a fool in boasting. You have compelled me, for I ought to have been commended by you. For in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostles, though I am nothing. Truly, the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. The Christians in Troas show themselves to be a faithful gathering of Jesus' followers. They're breaking bread, they're worshiping God, and they're existing in unity, much like we see in Acts 2. Acts 2, 42 to 43 says the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. Awe came upon everyone, because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. But on a more practical note, how do I apply this to my life now? Allow me to share some observations found in one of the resources that will be listed at the end of your handouts, because I like to give credit where credit is due. May or may not have been perhaps Luke's intended message. I tend to lean more toward the authenticating, showing the power of God in authenticating Paul as an apostle, because that was something he had to find himself doing several times. But there are some good observations in these notes related to our walk with God. So on that subject, what can we learn from the story of Eutychus? Number one, make sure you stay close to the source. Stay close to God. It's an important part of growing in Christ. The early church, as we have seen in Acts, made getting together a priority in their life. The best place to be is as close to Jesus as possible. Why would you want to be near Jesus but not next to him? Eutychus had chosen to sit somewhere a distance away from where Paul was teaching. Present, perhaps not quite as engaged as those sitting closer. There are always people who will choose to be spectators to what God is doing. Sure, Eutychus was there, but he wasn't on the inside of where God was moving. He had positioned himself on the edge. We can tend to want to watch what God is doing, but don't actually want to participate. Christianity was never meant to be a spectator sport, but honestly, you know if you're merely interested or if you're actually involved. Next is make sure you don't fall asleep. For some people, it's not just a proximity problem, it's an attention problem. You can't even pay attention to what God is doing when you're there. You sing the songs, but you don't really worship. You listen to the sermon, but you don't apply it. You talk to others, but you don't love them. You serve someone, but you do it grudgingly. Take your relationship with God seriously. Don't fall asleep. Mark 13, 35 to 37 says, Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning. lest, coming suddenly, he find you sleeping. And what I say to you all, watch. In Mark 14:37-42, Jesus goes to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. He comes back to find his disciples asleep. It reads, "Then he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, 'Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.' Again he went and prayed and spoke the same words, and when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. Then he came a third time and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough, the hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.'" And lastly, Romans 13:11, "And do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. And lastly, keep close to brothers and sisters in the Lord." Part of the story is that Eutychus, even though he wasn't fully paying attention, was still hanging out with the Christians. Sometimes we seem to think that just because we're not feeling it, we can skip church or fellowship. You can be a bystander and still receive some blessings. Now, this isn't a goal to aim for, but God is merciful, and he allows for a certain amount of our youthful shortcomings. Eutychus was brought back to life despite his lack of attention. How awesome is it that when he fell out of the window, Paul stops his preaching and runs down and performs a miracle in his life. Even if we are stupid enough to fall out of a window because we fall asleep, God still wants to bless us. Now, I'm not saying to go and test God by recklessly sitting in a window or doing something equally stupid, by falling asleep and dying so God can bless you. But you have a choice in what you do and how you do it. So my final 3 points for you to remember are: you can make a choice to stay close to Jesus. You can make a choice to not fall asleep. And finally, you can make a choice to spend time with people who have the ability to help you when you fall. So while I do think the main point of this was proving his authority as an apostle, I like these points because I think there is something to be gleaned from everything in Scripture. And the most important thing is that our walk with the Lord be maintained, and that we stand, and that we stay firm, and in this case, that we don't fall asleep. So thank you for coming again next week. We'll be talking, probably going to actually get through to Paul's visit to third heaven. And after that will be what follows immediately, which is Paul's thorn in the flesh. So please join us, and thank you.